All right, welcome back. This is part 5 and the final video in this series where we're talking about Bitcoin fundamental analysis. And this is where we're talking about off-chain factors. So what's all the stuff that can happen in the world that affects Bitcoin's price and ecosystem and the health of the network that doesn't have anything to do with blockchain transactions? So let's do a quick recap of what you've learned so far. In the first video, we talked about token economics, which is really the foundation of Bitcoin's economy. And you really need to understand this stuff before you go any further. The second video is all about growth metrics, where you can look at Bitcoin and say, is it currently growing or contracting in users and capital flow and all that stuff? And then valuation models. What is Bitcoin's current and future potential value? This is really important to think about. And in the last video, this was my favorite subject when we start talking about market timing tools. Basically, when is the best time to buy and when is the best time to sell? And then today we're talking about off-chain factors, everything that impacts Bitcoin's price and adoption. So let's talk about what is the difference between on-chain and off-chain factors. So on-chain is basically all the data and all the analysis that we can use that comes from transactions directly on Bitcoin's blockchain. And there's a ton of information we can derive from it because it is public. You know, a lot of people talk about the anonymous nature of Bitcoin. It's actually way more transparent than any fiat currency system because you can see every transaction that takes place. But when we start talking about off-chain stuff, this is everything else that can influence Bitcoin that isn't directly related to those transactions. So how do these off-chain factors actually impact Bitcoin? The first thing I want to point out is Bitcoin is the world's first global decentralized permissionless market. And that is massive, guys. This is the first time anything like this has happened in the history of humanity. But it also means it's the most complex market to try to figure out because it includes everybody around the world. And what that means is it is subject to the most amount of variables. You know, think about all the local economies that interact with Bitcoin on a daily basis and all of the government regulators, not just in the US, but all over the world. There's so many governments trying to inject regulations into the space. And the capital flow coming from all corners of the world. And then when you add in speculators and hodlers and all market participants that all have different goals and opinions and visions for the future of Bitcoin. So when we're thinking about all these factors, keep in mind that one country or even just one market participant can swing the direction of Bitcoin's price massively. For example, traditional financial markets like the stock market here in the US can swing Bitcoin's price, or competing crypto assets can actually draw capital to Bitcoin or away from it. So because there's so many variables, I think it just makes sense to weigh the global macro picture, which can be really overwhelming and really impossible to predict, and keep it simple. You know, if you try to figure out what every government and every investor and every competing crypto asset's going to do, you're going to drive yourself crazy. So here's what I like to do. I like to look at things like, who are the large players that are moving into the space? Are there any companies that recently said they were going to hold some of their cash in Bitcoin or accept it as payment? Are there any governments that are stepping in and saying, we're going to use Bitcoin in a specific way, right? Are there any large famous investors like Paul Tudor Jones or Tim Draper or other people that, and this domino is falling, by the way, so many really smart, large investors are coming out in support of Bitcoin, talking about how they're allocating part of their personal net worth and their funds to Bitcoin. Also, what regulation is coming down the pipeline from large governments? You know, you have some countries that try to ban Bitcoin, you have other countries that are embracing it, and you start to see where the capital is flowing from and where the talent is going to. And I've always said this since the early days of Bitcoin, that governments that try to repress Bitcoin or just outright ban it, they are stealing the prosperity, the future prosperity of their citizens. Also, what's the current market sentiment from mom and pop investors? Meaning at the dinner table or on, retail investor networks like CNBC. What is the current opinion or market sentiment of Bitcoin? Is everybody really hot on it? Is it down in the dumps and everybody wants to forget about it and calling it a scam? if you do the opposite of what the mass majority of people are doing, you're typically going to be on the right side of price action. Also, what new crypto assets are either launching or existing crypto assets that are competing with Bitcoin? What are the new developments there? And could it take some market cap away from Bitcoin? And when you're looking at all this stuff, I think the quality of your decision-making process is going to come from the quality of the questions that you ask. So let's look at a few questions that I think are really wise questions to ask yourself as you dive into this space. The first is, how does good and bad news currently affect Bitcoin's price? Now, we've seen several moments in time where news pieces, both good and bad, will affect Bitcoin's price in different ways depending on where it is in the current market cycle. What I mean by that is sometimes when Bitcoin's price is trending to the upside, it will act very resilient and anti-fragile in the face of bad news. So there may be a big hack or a government comes out in opposition to Bitcoin. And sometimes you'll see like a little sell-off, but really it's just a blip and the market just doesn't give a damn. Other times we might be in a bear market and some bad news will come out and that will actually crash Bitcoin's price by 30% in one day. So something I'm constantly doing is paying attention to the major news pieces that come out, and there's always something going on in Bitcoin, by the way. And I ask, well, how is this affecting Bitcoin's price? And when I see just some weeks, you'll feel like, man, Bitcoin can't catch a break. There's just one bad thing after the other coming out, and it just seems like the world is ending. But when you look at price action on the chart, you go, man, the market just doesn't really seem to care about this. It just shrugs it off. That tells me that Bitcoin is being very resilient, and the anticipation is that long trades, meaning breakouts or dip buys, could be good opportunities. Where if the converse is happening, maybe we want to flip to shorting and making money as price goes down. Another question we could ask is, how does Bitcoin respond to stock market panics? So in March 2020, we saw when the coronavirus fears hit, the stock market panicked, gold panicked, and Bitcoin panicked. Typically, when there's a shock to the system, when something like a black swan event happens, all markets, maybe except for bonds, because sometimes they work inversely, but the majority of assets will initially have a sell-off panic together. Other times, you might have some news that comes out about the stock market. You know, maybe it's a large FANG stock that has bad earnings or something, and that'll kind of shake up the stock market, but Bitcoin will be moving inverse or uncorrelated to that. I really like when Bitcoin's moving kind of disjointed from the stock market. When it's kind of following or correlated with the stock market, that's actually a sign of weakness. I like to look for signs of resiliency in Bitcoin when it's moving to the beat of its own drum. And the next question is, who are the key companies and governments that are currently entering into Bitcoin? So at the time of recording this video in late 2020, there have been a ton of governments, corporations, both private and public companies, and big famous investors that have been coming out in support of Bitcoin, either saying they're buying the hell out of it, or they're using it or supporting it in some way. And when you have momentum like that, that can really be a big sign. And the next question is, what is the latest regulation around crypto assets from major economies? So what I'm talking about here is like major economies like the US and Europe. I really don't care so much about what China says because they have quote unquote banned Bitcoin about a dozen times in the past 10 years. So you can't really trust what comes out of there. But with, you know, the Western economies, this is where regulation actually matters. And in the US to date, I would actually say we've had pretty fair and balanced regulation so far. You know, the regulators in the US are all kind of fighting for control, but they obviously want to protect investors and reduce scams, but they're typically late to the party. So typically if you get some kind of action from like the SEC, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that Bitcoin is going to get hammered. You know, usually that information is priced in or a lot of people know it's coming, but it is important to know like, hey, are major economies, are they fighting it? Are they embracing it? Is there a lot of questions or a hybrid? And this is a little more subjective, but it is important to kind of keep yourself aware of. And the final question is, what global macroeconomic developments could impact Bitcoin's price or the adoption curve? And this is where things get really weird. when we start talking about inflation, when we start talking about monetary policy, when we start talking about all of these governments trying to release their own central bank digital currencies, this is where you introduce a lot of opinion, but not a lot of substance. And what I mean by that is the world is a very complex place, and there's a lot of talking heads on the news that talk about the global macro picture, but are very rarely accurate over a career with their predictions because it's just so hard to predict. So I give the global macro picture kind of the least weight out of all these questions. You know, I'm more worried about what's actually happening on chain and with the growth metrics, and then some of these things like how is Bitcoin reacting to price and stock market panics. And I try not to get too caught up trying to predict where the world is going on a global economic kind of macro level. So thank you so much for watching these videos. I hope you got a ton of value from it. Again, like it up, subscribe to the channel, share it with anybody that you think would get value. And also leave me a comment. I want to know what types of videos do you want to see next? Hopefully you are diving headfirst into the Bitcoin ecosystem and learning as much as you can. And I'm here to be a resource if I can help in any way. Reach out. And if you want to join a community of investors, I'll link that up below. We have our wealth building community at the Skill Incubator. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Take care.